She did not cry. That was the part nobody in that room could understand. Seo Kang-hyun walked into his family's Hudson River estate with another woman on his arm, not hiding her, not apologizing, not even glancing sideways. He introduced Yuna Baek to his mother, his uncle, his most trusted associates. Smiled the way a man smiles when he has already decided the outcome of something. And Amara Lennox, his wife of 8 years, the woman who had quietly saved his empire 3 times over, sat only 12 feet away and watched every second of it. She did not raise her voice. She did not leave the room. She waited. And when the moment was right, she removed her wedding ring, set it on top of a sealed legal envelope beside his dinner plate, looked directly into his eyes, and said 4 words that would dismantle everything he had spent a decade building. Let her save you. If that was you, if that was your name on those documents, your money holding up someone else's throne, what would you have done? If you're watching this and you've ever been the person standing behind someone else's success while they took every last piece of the credit, stay with me. Because this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what a woman does when she finally decides she's done being invisible. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button before we go any further, because stories like this one don't slow down, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The Sunday started the way most SEO family Sundays did, with a particular kind of quiet that exists inside very large, very expensive spaces that are technically homes but feel more like performance venues. The Hudson River estate had been in Kang-hyun's family for 11 years. It had 12 rooms, a private dock, a chef who came in on weekends, and a security detail that rotated in shifts. The grounds were immaculate in the way that grounds become immaculate when someone is paid well enough not to miss anything. Amara had always privately thought the house looked like it was designed to impress people who weren't going to be there long. She arrived 20 minutes before the family lunch was scheduled to begin, which was her habit. She believed in arriving before things started so that she could understand the room before the room started performing. She set her bag near the front entrance, said hello to the 2 staff members she'd known for 6 years by name Marcus, who handled the exterior, and Jees, who managed the interior on weekends, and made her way through the main corridor toward the west sitting room, where the family typically gathered before food. She was wearing a dark olive dress, low heels. The diamond earrings Kang-hyun had given her on their 5th anniversary, which she wore to family not because they were her favorites, but because she understood what symbols meant to people who organized their lives around them. His mother, Seo Myung-ja, was already seated near the window. 63 years old, impeccably dressed, with the kind of posture that came from decades of believing the world was watching. She acknowledged Amara's entrance with a brief nod and returned her attention to the garden outside. In 8 years, Myung-ja had never asked Amara a single question about her work. Amara had stopped expecting her to. The family began filling in around 12:15. Kang-hyun's uncle, Seo Daewon, arrived with 2 of his associates and settled into his customary chair near the fireplace, with the ease of a man who had claimed that seat so many times it had simply become his. He was 61, thick through the shoulders, with silver at his temples, and a way of watching rooms that reminded Amara of someone running a calculation they didn't intend to share. Daewon greeted Amara warmly. He always did. It was a warmth Amara had spent several years appreciating before she recognized it for what it actually was. The warmth of a man who needed to keep her comfortable enough not to ask hard questions. She had learned to receive it without believing it. 2 of Kang-hyun's senior associates, Park Hyun-soo and Lim Chae-won, arrived with their wives. Greetings were exchanged. The room settled into the particular conversational rhythm of people who knew each other well enough to have stopped being honest with each other. Kang-hyun arrived at 12:34. He was not alone. Amara was standing near the far end of the room, a glass of water in her hand, mid-conversation with Chae-won's wife about something neither of them cared much about. She noticed the shift in the room before she processed why. A slight recalibration postures, adjusting eyes moving toward the entrance, the kind of collective reaction. That happens when something has entered a space that changes the atmospheric pressure of it. She turned. Kang-hyun was standing in the entrance of the sitting room in a dark charcoal suit, looking precisely as composed as he always looked. With the easy authority of a man who had never once in his adult life walked into a room and wondered whether people were glad to see him. Beside him was a woman Amara had never seen before. She was Korean, perhaps 36, 37, elegant in a structured way, the kind of elegance that requires effort and knows it. Dark hair, understated jewelry, an expression that was carefully calibrated to project confidence without aggression. She stood just close enough to Kang-hyun that the proximity communicated something before a single word was spoken. Amara set her water glass down on the side table. The sound was barely audible. No one turned to look. Kang-hyun moved into the room with the woman at his side and began making introductions. His mother first. "Iyama, this is Yuna. Yuna Baek." Myungja stood. She took Yuna's hands in both of hers. She smiled, a real one, the kind she had never once offered Amara in 8 years of Amara being married to her son. "I've heard so much," Myungja said. Those 4 words hit the room like something structural giving way. Amara did not move. She was aware of her own stillness with the clinical precision of someone who has trained themselves over not to react in the spaces where reactions are expected. Kang-hyun moved to his uncle next. Daewon rose from his chair and clasped Yuna's hand with both of his, nodding with a kind of approval that meant he had known this was coming and had considered it acceptable. Then to Park Hyun-soo, then Lim Chae-won. Everyone knew her name. Everyone had apparently already been told. And Amara understood. Standing in the far corner of a room she had helped furnish, wearing earrings she hadn't originally wanted, that she was not a surprise to anyone in this room except herself. She had been the only person not told. Kang-hyun finally looked at her. "Subdeen." He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to confirm that he was not going to pretend this wasn't happening, and short enough to signal that he wasn't going to address it either. Then he looked away. That was the moment. Not the woman at his side. Not the introductions. Not even the smile his mother had given a stranger. It was the 2-second look and the deliberate turning away, the decision not to say a single word that told Amara everything she needed to know about how the next phase of her life was going to begin. She excused herself from the conversation she'd been in, walked quietly through the corridor, retrieved her bag from near the entrance, and sat down alone in the adjacent dining room, where the table had already been set for 14. She sat there for 6 minutes. Then she reached into her bag, removed the envelope she had prepared, 3 days earlier sealed, addressed, sitting beside a personal note from her attorney, and placed it carefully on the table. She looked at the chair where Kang-hyun always sat. She looked at his plate. She removed her wedding ring, set it on top of the envelope, returned to the sitting room doorway, waited for one of the natural pauses in conversation, and said not loudly, not with any particular heat, just clearly enough that the people nearest to her stopped talking. "Kang-hyun." He turned. She looked directly at him. Then, with a small tilt of her head in the direction of the dining room, "There's something on the table for you." She looked at Yuna Baek for exactly 1 second. "Let her save your empire today." She picked up her bag, walked to the front entrance, nodded once to Marcus, and left the estate. She sat in the back of her car for the 11-minute drive to the main road without saying a word to the driver. She watched the iron gate close behind them in the rearview mirror. She did not cry. A sound this is for 72 hours, which was how long it had taken her after discovering what she discovered on Thursday night, to understand that everything she'd thought was a marriage had actually been something else entirely. But to understand that, you have to go back. Not to the beginning of the marriage, because the beginning had been real. She was certain of that much even now. Kang-hyun at 34 had been something she hadn't anticipated, careful and direct in a way that most powerful men aren't, because powerful men usually learn early that they don't have to be. He had been genuinely curious about her work, which was unusual. He had asked her questions that demonstrated listen to the previous answers, which was rarer still. She had met him through a financial restructuring consultation. Black Harbor Syndicate's legitimate corporate arm had been hemorrhaging money through a failed hospitality expansion in Southeast Asia, and the investment group Amara worked for, at the time had been brought in to assess damage and recommend recovery strategies. She had spent 3 weeks inside their books. She was 33. She had spent a decade building expertise that consistently got her placed in rooms where nobody expected her to be the most technically capable person present, and she had spent an equivalent decade learning to operate in those rooms without demanding credit for being there. She was very good at her work. Kang-hyun noticed, not in the way men in his position sometimes noticed women who were good at things, which was to say, as a curiosity to be managed. He noticed the way someone notices a peer with specific attention, real questions, the occasional professional argument. They were married 14 months after they met. She remembered thinking at the time that she was making a clear-eyed decision. She knew what he was. She wasn't naive about the organization behind the legitimate businesses. She understood the architecture of it, the legitimate companies on top, the criminal infrastructure below, the careful insulation between the two. She had told herself she was marrying the man, not the empire. She had been wrong about that distinction, but it had taken years to understand why. In the first 2 years, the marriage worked the way good partnerships work, with friction and accommodation and the ongoing negotiation of two people who respect each other enough to stay honest. She traveled for her own work. He traveled for his. They kept separate professional lives while building a shared personal one. Then Black Harbor nearly fell apart. It was the second year of their marriage. A series of bad investments in the legitimate shipping division, combined with frozen credit from a banking partner who had become nervous after a regulatory inquiry, created a liquidity crisis that threatened to topple the entire legitimate corporate structure within 90 days. Kang-hyun came to her. He didn't ask immediately. He explained the situation with the full technical detail of someone briefing a professional, not a spouse, which she had appreciated. He outlined the exposure. He outlined the timeline. He outlined what would happen to the 540 people employed by the legitimate companies if the crisis wasn't resolved. Then he asked. She said yes because she loved him. She also said yes because she was genuinely capable of solving the problem, and she found it difficult to watch a solvable problem remain unsolved when she had the means to solve it. She restructured the credit facilities using her own guarantees as collateral. She personally contacted 3 investors she had relationships with and negotiated bridge financing at terms no outside party would have offered Black Harbor on its own merits. She renegotiated the banking relationship. It took 11 weeks. When it was done, Black Harbor's legitimate arm was stable. Kang-hyun received congratulations from his uncle, his associates, his business partners. Nobody congratulated Amara, not because they didn't know they knew. But congratulating her would have required acknowledging that the organization's survival had depended on its boss's wife, and that acknowledgement would have redistributed authority in ways that none of the men in that room were prepared to accept. Amara understood this clearly. She told herself it didn't matter, because the outcome had been what she'd wanted, which was stability and the protection of people's livelihoods. That was the first time. The second time came 3 years later, when a different type of crisis, a hostile acquisition attempt, targeting one of Black Harbor's most profitable legitimate subsidiaries, required a counter-strategy that only someone with Amara's specific combination of financial expertise and professional network could execute. She spent 4 months on that one. The subsidiary was saved. Again, Kang-hyun received the credit. Again, Amara told herself it didn't matter. The third time was 18 months ago. A financial irregularity inside a legitimate investment vehicle had created regulatory exposure. Amara had identified it, assessed the risk, and helped restructure the entity before anyone outside the organization noticed. That one she had handled in 6 weeks. By that point, something had shifted in the marriage that she'd been aware of for a while, but hadn't yet named. Kang-hyun was not unkind. He was not absent. He was not the kind of man who forgot their anniversary or failed to notice when she was struggling. But somewhere in the years between the first rescue and the third, he had stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as a reliable resource. The way you see a structural wall, you don't think about it constantly. You just know it's going to be there, and you build around that assumption. She had noticed it the way you notice a slow temperature drop. Not all at once, but in accumulations. The way he stopped asking her opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with finances. The way family gatherings began to feel like she was attending someone else's event as a plus one. The way his mother had started making comments, nothing direct, never direct, always the oblique Korean language observations that didn't require translation about Amara's inability to be what a Seo family wife was supposed to be. She had said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. She'd had a lot of practice. But then Thursday, she had been reviewing some old financial files, not for any specific purpose, just the kind of professional housekeeping she did periodically to keep her own records clean when she found a discrepancy. Transfer. Money connected to one of her guarantee structures from 3 years earlier, routed through an intermediary entity she didn't recognize. The amount wasn't enormous by the scale of the transaction she managed, but the routing was deliberate. The structure was specific. This wasn't an error. She spent 4 hours on Thursday night pulling records. By midnight, she had found Obsidian Meridian Holdings. By 2 in the morning, she had found her own signature on documents she had never signed for that purpose. By 4, she had called Lenora. By 6, she understood that someone, possibly multiple people, had been using her financial identity as a shell for years, and that Kang-hyun's name was in the paperwork. She had sat at her kitchen table in the Manhattan apartment they used during the week, in the blue-gray light of early Friday morning, and she had felt the specific grief of someone watching a version of their life that they had thought was rearrange itself into something else entirely. She didn't cry then either. She had made coffee. She had called Lenora back at 7. She had started writing a list. The envelope she placed on the table at the Hudson River estate on Sunday afternoon had been assembled over 3 days. It contained a formal notice of her intent to unwind her financial guarantees to the Black Harbor legitimate corporate entities. Preliminary legal memo from Lenora's firm documenting Amara's rights and the protective mechanisms she was activating, and one handwritten line on a card. I kept your empire alive. Now let's see who does it next. She had not written it out of cruelty. She had written it because she needed him to understand, immediately, before she was out of the driveway, that what he was looking at was not a wife having an emotional reaction. It was a professional unwinding what she had built. Those were very different things. The car reached the main road. The driver asked, without turning around, if she wanted to go directly back to Manhattan. Yes, she said. She looked out the window at the river. Behind her, in a dining room, in an estate she'd helped furnish, with a ring on an envelope she'd spent 3 days preparing, Seo Kang-hyun was sitting down to lunch with his mistress, his mother, his uncle, and his associates. In approximately 4 minutes, he was going to see the envelope. In approximately 8 minutes, he was going to understand what was in it. And sometime after that tonight, tomorrow morning, soon he was going to start making calls and begin to realize that the woman he had spent the last several years treating as furniture had quietly, methodically, in the middle of doing everything else he needed her to do, been building the means of her own exit. Amara pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the car window. The river moved fast in November. She had always liked that about it. The envelope sat on the table for 4 minutes before anyone touched it. Kang-hyun had come into the dining room, expecting the usual arrangement, the staff moving quietly between the kitchen and the table, his mother already positioned at her end. The rhythm of Sunday lunch settling into the comfortable predictability he'd grown used to. What he found instead was a place setting with a sealed envelope and a ring on top of it, and a room that had gone very still. He picked up the ring first. He knew it immediately. He'd chosen it himself. Platinum band, modest by the standards of what he could spend, because Amara had told him once early, before he'd stopped listening carefully, that she found large jewelry performative. He'd remembered that. He'd thought, at the time, that remembering small things about a person was the same as knowing them. He set the ring down. He picked up the envelope. His name was on the front in Lenora Quaid's firm's letterhead, not Amara's handwriting, which told him immediately that this was not an emotional decision. Lawyers don't appear on envelopes in the first 4 hours of an emotional decision. Lawyers appear on envelopes when someone has been thinking for days and has already made up their mind before the moment you think triggered them. He opened it. He read the first page in 90 seconds. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again more slowly, because the first read had moved too fast through the parts that mattered, and he needed to understand specifically what she had done, not just that she had done something. By the second reading, the room had emptied behind him. He hadn't noticed anyone leave. He had a vague awareness that Yuna had said something to him from the doorway, her voice, a question, concern in it, and that he hadn't answered. He was on the third page. When he finally looked up, Daewon was standing at the other end of the table. Just standing there. His uncle's face had the expression of a man watching something expensive break in slow motion and already calculating whether any of the pieces were salvageable. "How bad?" Daewon asked. Kang-hyun set the papers down flat on the table. "She froze the guarantees," he said. "All of them." Simultaneously, Daewon pulled out the chair across from him and sat down heavily. "The credit facilities. We'll get review notices by Tuesday morning." Kang-hyun's voice was level. It was the voice he used when the situation was serious enough that letting any feeling into it would make it worse. The Meridian Bridge arrangement, the Park Avenue refinancing, the Incheon subsidiary collateral, all of it tied back to her personal guarantees in some configuration. When lenders see she's unwinding them, they'll want explanations. "Can we cover the exposure?" Kang-hyun looked at his uncle for a moment. "Not immediately," he said. "Not without Amara." Those 3 words sat in the room like a structural diagnosis that nobody wanted confirmed out loud. Daewon pressed his palms flat on the table. "She won't go this far. She knows what happens to the businesses if she knows exactly what happens." Kang-hyun cut him off without raising his voice. "That's not an accident. She's not threatening anything she doesn't understand precisely." "Then call her." "Not yet." "Kang-hyun," I said, "not yet." This time there was an edge in it. Not anger, something sharper. The edge of a man who has just understood that he is in a situation he cannot command his way out of and is buying himself 60 seconds to accept that before anyone sees him try. If I call her in the first hour, she knows I'm panicking. And if she knows I'm panicking, she knows she has more leverage than even she thought she had. Daewon was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she knows about the Meridian structure?" he asked. The question landed differently than Daewon intended, or possibly exactly as he intended. It was sometimes hard to tell with his uncle. Kang-hyun looked at him steadily. "What makes you ask that?" "Because if she knows, why would she know?" Daewon said nothing. And in the silence between them, Kang-hyun felt the first cold thread of something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of a man who has kept several compartments in his mind carefully separated and is beginning to understand that one of them has a leak. He folded the papers back into the envelope. "Get me Jamin," he said. "Tonight." Daewon nodded and left the room. Kang-hyun sat alone at the dining room table, where 14 place settings were still arranged for a lunch that wasn't going to happen. He picked up the ring, turned it once between his fingers, set it back down. He did not call Amara. He called his chief of operations instead and told him to begin preparing a contingency review of every credit facility and financing arrangement tied to the legitimate corporate entities. He used the word audit because it sounded less urgent than what it actually was. Then he sat very still for a while and did something he hadn't done in years. He tried to remember the last time he had asked his wife how she was doing. Not how the finances were. Not whether she'd reviewed a specific document. Not the professional check-ins that had replaced actual conversation somewhere in the last several years. Just how she was doing. He couldn't place a specific date. Splitting. That bothered him in a way that was separate from everything else, and which he pushed away from quickly because there was no useful action that came from sitting in it. He had a business crisis to manage. He picked up his phone and called Jaemin Kwan. Amara's Manhattan apartment was on the 23rd floor of a building in the West 50s that she had purchased. 3 years into the marriage using her own funds, structured in her own name, in a way that had nothing to do with Black Harbor or any of its associated entities. She had done it carefully and quietly, and when Kang-hyun had asked about it at the time, she had told him she needed a professional base that was entirely separate from their shared assets. He had accepted that explanation. She had meant every word of it. She had also understood, even then, that the act of securing her own independent space was something she needed to do not because she had planned to leave, but because some part of her understood that needing a place to go was not the same thing as planning to use it. She arrived back at the apartment at 2:17 in the afternoon. Lenora Quade was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 laptops and a legal pad that already had 2 pages of notes on it. Lenora was 54, Nigerian-American, with natural hair going silver at the temples and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to attorneys who have been in enough high-stakes rooms to understand that visible urgency helps no one. She looked up when Amara came through the door. "Done?" Lenora asked. "Done," Amara said. "Ring left it on the envelope." Lenora nodded. "Good. Cleaner." She pushed a coffee mug across the table. "Sit." Amara sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug even though she wasn't cold. There was something grounding about having something solid to hold. "He'll call," Lenora said. "I know, probably within 6 hours. Maybe sooner, once his people start running the exposure numbers." "I told him not to call." Amara looked at Lenora. "Not in those words. But he's smart enough to understand the message." "Smart enough to understand it," Lenora said, "doesn't mean smart enough not to do it." She clicked to a new screen on her laptop. "Okay. The freeze is in place across all 5 guarantee structures. Lenders will start seeing the documentation Monday morning, but some of the automated monitoring systems may flag it as early as tonight. I want to be ready for calls by 7 a.m. tomorrow. Who do we expect to move first? The Park Avenue refinancing the covenant terms are the tightest there. Second would be the Incheon facility. The Meridian Bridge arrangement is technically the most exposure, but the contact there is slower to react. He'll wait to see which way the wind is blowing before picking up the phone." Amara nodded. "And the legitimate employees?" "I've been over the corporate structure 3 times since Thursday." Lenora met her eyes. "Every entity where innocent employees have primary exposure, we've flagged for protective notification. No one loses their job because of what we're doing. That's what the memo in the envelope was for, to make clear that this is a targeted unwind, not a scorched earth. He needs to understand that distinction. He will. Give him a few hours to get past the shock and start actually reading." Amara wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. There was a woman. Lenora didn't react to the change in subject, which was one of the things Amara valued most about her. "Tell me." He introduced her to his family. "In front of me." His mother already knew her name. She said it the way you say something you've already processed, not without pain, but without any expectation that saying it will make the pain larger or smaller. "He didn't say a word to me the entire time." "How long?" "Based on what I found Thursday, at minimum 2 years. Possibly more." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Amara." "Don't." Amara said it without harshness. "I can't have sympathy right now. I need to think." "Okay." Lenora turned back to her laptop. "Then let's think." They worked through the afternoon. By 6 o'clock, they had a complete picture of every financial arrangement connected to Amara's guarantees, what had been legitimately deployed, what had been recovered through normal business operations, and what, after Thursday night's discovery, still required explanation. The Obsidian Meridian portion was $31 million. $31 million that moved through a structure Amara had never authorized, secured against instruments that bore her signature in configurations she had not agreed to, and distributed into an offshore-linked investment architecture that had been operating for at least 5 years. Lenora had found the first thread on Friday morning. By Saturday night, they had the outline. By Sunday afternoon, they had enough to understand the shape of what had been done, even if the full detail was still being assembled. Who built it? Amara had asked, the first time she'd seen the structure laid out clearly. Someone who knew how to work inside the existing architecture without being obvious, Lenora had said. This isn't an amateur job. Whoever did this understood your guarantee structures from the inside. That narrowed it considerably. The list of people who understood Amara's financial structures from the inside was very short. Amara, Lenora, and the two in-house financial people at Black Harbor who had worked on the legitimate side of the rescue packages. One of those was Jaemin Kwan. His phone rang at 8:43 that evening. He was at his apartment in Midtown on the 21st call of the day when Kang-hyun's number appeared on his screen. He had been expecting this call. He had been expecting it since the afternoon, when the first quiet message from Daewon had reached him with two words, "Call needed." He answered, "Kang-hyun, come to the office." Kang-hyun's voice was the level one, the serious one. "Tonight. It's after 9, I know what time it is." A pause that contained a full sentence worth of meaning. "Come tonight." Jaemin closed the other call. He sat for a moment in his apartment, looking at nothing in particular, doing the mental calculation of someone who has been managing a very complicated situation for a long time and can feel the walls beginning to close. He called a number that was not in his phone's contact list. It rang 3 times. "She moved," he said, when the call connected. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Calm. Careful. "When today? The guarantees are frozen." A pause. "All of them?" "All of them. I need to know whether—" "Don't call this number again," the woman said. And she ended the call. Jaemin sat very still. Then he got up, put on his coat, and went to meet his boss. The Black Harbor legitimate corporate offices occupied the top 2 floors of a building in Lower Manhattan with views of the harbor that were better at night than during the day, which Amara had always thought said something about the organization's relationship with visibility. After hours, the space had a particular quality, the lights turned lower, the staff gone. The daytime, professional atmosphere giving way to something that was closer to what the organization actually was when it stopped performing for the outside world. Kang-hyun was at the conference table when Jaemin arrived. No assistants, no associates, just Kang-hyun and Daewon sitting across from each other with a printed set of documents between them that Jaemin recognized from 20 feet away. He had helped create them. He sat down without being told to. He folded his hands on the table. He had the particular composure of a man who has decided that the only survivable version of the next hour is one where he controls the rate at which information comes out. "The guarantees," Kang-hyun said without preamble. "I heard. Tell me the exposure across the legitimate entities." Jaemin walked through it. He was precise. He did not omit anything that couldn't be omitted. He omitted the things that could be. This was his professional skill, knowing exactly where the seams were and where a careful man could stand without being visible. When he finished, Kang-hyun was quiet for a moment. "The Meridian Bridge arrangement," he said. Jaemin's hand stayed flat on the table. "What about it?" "The collateral structure. Walk me through it again." "It's Amara's guarantee, cross-secured with— I know what it says on paper." Kang-hyun's voice hadn't changed in temperature, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Walk me through what it actually is." Jaemin looked at him. Dae was watching from the side. Daewon was watching from the trying to determine how much the person across from him already knows, which was the same calculation Jaemin himself was running. "It's a standard collateral arrangement," Jaemin said. "Is it?" "Yes." Kang-hyun let that sit for 3 seconds. "Jaemin, I've known you for 11 years. In 11 years, you've never once described something to me as standard, unless you needed me to stop looking at it." The room was very quiet. Jaemin recalibrated. "There's a secondary structure attached to the Meridian Bridge facility. It was created as a protective layer, a way of ensuring that if the primary collateral ever came under scrutiny, there was sufficient distance between the organization's legitimate exposure and the—" "Whose idea?" Kang-hyun said. "It was a financial architecture decision." "Whose idea?" Jaemin looked at the table. "I designed the structure. The directive to create it came from—" He stopped. "Say it." "It came from a conversation, several conversations. Over the course of roughly 18 months, not a single instruction. A series of understandings. Between you and who?" Jaemin looked up. He looked directly at Kang-hyun, and what passed between them in that moment was the specific recognition of 2 men who have spent years operating in the space between what is said and what is meant, and who both know right now that the space has collapsed. Between you and me, Jaemin said, and Daewon. The room went absolutely still. Kang-hyun did not move. He did not look at his uncle. He kept his eyes on Jaemin. And Amara's signatures, Kang-hyun said, on the meridian instruments. How did they get there? Jaemin was quiet for a long moment. Some of them were taken from other documents, she signed. Digitally isolated and transferred. Some of them he stopped again. Some of them were on documents, she signed, without knowing what the full package contained. The accompanying structure was created after the fact, attached to instruments she'd agreed to at a higher level. The word sat in the room. Kang-hyun finally looked at his uncle. Daewon was looking at the table. You knew, Kang-hyun said. It wasn't a question. I knew it was a risk management structure. You knew her signatures were being used without her authorization. Daewon did not answer. Look at me, Kang-hyun said. Daewon looked up. His face had the worn, tired expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he has to put it down in public. I knew the structure existed, Daewon said. I didn't ask every question I should have asked. The silence that followed was the kind that restructures a room. Kang-hyun stood up. He moved to the window, the harbor view, dark water and city light, and stood there with his back to both of them, for long enough that Jaemin and Daewon exchanged one glance across the table. A glance that communicated between two men who had worked inside Black Harbor long enough to read its atmospherics. This is very bad. When Kang-hyun turned back around, his face was controlled in the way a face is controlled when the thing beneath it is not. Jaemin, he said, you're going to write down everything. Every transaction, every instrument, every conversation you remember. You're going to do it tonight, and you're going to give it to me by tomorrow morning. Jaemin nodded, and Daewon. He looked at his uncle. You and I are going to have a separate conversation. Not tonight. Jaemin left. Daewon left. Kang-hyun stood at the window for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. He scrolled to Amara's contact. He looked at her name on the screen. He did not call. Instead, he put the phone in his pocket and stood there, trying to calculate the way he calculated everything, methodically, without sentiment how much of what Jaemin had just told him he had actually known in some form, and told himself was something different. He got to a number he didn't like. At 11:17 that night, Amara's phone lit up with a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. It had been a long day, 16 hours of focused legal work, 2 hours of Lenora walking her through scenarios she needed to understand, and the sustained low-grade physical drain of a day that had required her to maintain absolute composure from 12:34 in the afternoon until she'd finally sat down alone at 9 p.m. She answered because she had a professional habit of answering numbers she didn't recognize after hours. In her experience, calls at that hour from unknown numbers were either irrelevant or critical, and the cost of missing a critical one was too high. Ms. Lennox. The voice was a woman splitting, precise, careful in the specific way of someone who has chosen every word before dialing. My name is Celeste Kwan. I'm Jaemin Kwan's wife. Amara went very still. I'm aware of who you are, she said. Then you'll know I have no reason to call you unless I had something to say that you needed to hear. A pause. I'm sorry for the hour. I didn't know when else I'd be able to call without. She stopped. Started again. My husband doesn't know I'm calling you. Okay. I found something. Celeste's voice was steady, but with a specific quality underneath it. The steadiness of a woman holding something together by concentration alone. Records he kept. Private ones. I found them 3 weeks ago, and I've been trying to understand what to do with them. Amara kept her voice level. What kind of records? Transactions. Internal notes, some of them handwritten. A pause that felt like a threshold. Miss Lennox, some of those notes are in your husband's handwriting. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, 23 floors down, Manhattan moved through its Sunday night as if nothing had shifted. Amara sat with the phone against her ear and let the information fully arrive. Can you come to me? She asked. Yes, Celeste said. Tell me when. Tomorrow morning, Amara said. 8 o'clock. She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, in the quiet flat with her hands the surface in front of her. She had believed, on Thursday night when she found the obsidian meridian structure, that the worst part was already behind her, that the worst thing was knowing someone had used her financial identity without her consent, and that Kang-hyun's name was adjacent to it, in ways she hadn't fully understood yet. She had believed the affair was a separate wound. She understood now that she had been wrong on both counts. The affair wasn't separate, and the wound she thought she'd already absorbed was not the deepest one. Celeste Kwan had just told her, in the careful language of someone who has had 3 weeks to choose her words, that there was handwritten evidence placing Kang-hyun directly inside the knowledge of what had been done with Amara's name, Amara's signatures, and Amara's financial identity. Not adjacent, inside. Amara pressed her hands flat on the table and held the weight of it. Tomorrow morning she would sit across from Celeste Kwan's and look at whatever was in those records. And after that, there would be no version of this situation that allowed her to protect Kang-hyun from what came next. Celeste Kwan arrived at 7:52 in the morning, 8 minutes early, which told Amara something about the state she was in. People who are calm arrive on time. People who are afraid of losing their nerve arrive before they can talk themselves out of it. She was smaller than Amara had expected. Maybe 41. With the kind of face that had once been very pretty, and now was something more interesting than pretty sharper, more specific. Worn into a particular shape by years of watching a man she'd married become someone she didn't recognize. She was carrying a canvas tote bag against her chest, with both arms, the way you carry something you're afraid someone might take from you. Amara opened the door before she knocked. Celeste blinked. Then she stepped inside. "Coffee?" Amara asked. "Please." Her voice was steadier in person than it had been on the phone. That happened sometimes. The anticipation of a thing was harder than the thing itself. They sat at the kitchen table. Amara poured. Neither of them touched the cups immediately. Celeste set the tote bag on the table between them, and then put both hands in her lap, and looked at Amara with the direct look of someone who has been rehearsing this conversation in their head for weeks, and has finally gotten to the room where it happens. "How much do you already know?" Celeste asked. "Enough to understand why you called me," Amara said. "Not enough to know what's in that bag." Celeste nodded. She reached into the tote and removed a manila folder, thick, the kind you get from an office supply store, the kind that has no label on the tab because the person who assembled it didn't want a label visible. She set it on the table and pushed it toward Amara, but kept one hand on top of it, as if she needed another second before letting it go completely. "I found these in his home office," Celeste said, "behind the false panel in the bottom drawer. I found the panel by accident. I was looking for a pen." She almost smiled at that. The absurdity of it. 3 weeks of reading everything in here before I called you. She lifted her hand. Amara opened the folder. The first thing she saw was a ledger page, not a printed document. An actual handwritten ledger. The kind of record-keeping that exists specifically because it doesn't run through any digital system that can be subpoenaed. Columns of figures. Dates going back 4 years. Transaction codes in a shorthand that she didn't immediately recognize, but which had the internal consistency of a system abbreviations that repeated, notations that corresponded to amounts, routing indicators. She turned the page. The second sheet was a printed email chain, the addresses redacted with black marker, but the content intact. 3 exchanges between 2 parties discussing the timing of a transfer through a structure referred to only as OM. One line in the second message said, "KH confirmed comfort with the routing. Proceed at your discretion. Kang-hyun." Amara turned to the third sheet. It was handwritten. Different handwriting from the ledger, larger, slightly left-leaning, the pen pressed harder into the paper in the way of someone who writes quickly when they're thinking. She knew this handwriting. She had seen it for birthday cards, and on notes left on kitchen counters, and on the margins of documents he'd reviewed when he still asked her to review things together with him. She read it twice. The note was not long, 12 lines. It was a contingency outline, not formatted, not official, Just the kind of thinking out loud that a careful man puts on paper when he needs to work through a scenario that he can't run past anyone else. The scenario it described was specific. In the event that the OM structure came under regulatory or legal scrutiny, splitting, the documentation trail should be examined to determine whether the existing signature architecture created sufficient distance between the organization's principles and the financial instruments in question. And then, in the margin, in the same handwriting, a single added line that had been written at a different time. The ink was slightly different. The angle of the letters changed that said, "As position cleanable if needed." Discuss with J. Amara J. Min, she set the page down. She did not slam it. She did not push it away. She set it down with the same controlled precision she had used to set her wedding ring on an envelope the day before. And she sat very still for a moment with her hands in her lap and let the full meaning of what she had just read assemble itself without rushing it. As position cleanable if needed. Not make sure Amara isn't implicated. Cleanable, as in, if the situation requires it, the documentation can be arranged to make Amara's involvement appear deliberate rather than fabricated. They had not been protecting her. They had been maintaining the option of using her. Celeste was watching her from across the table. She hadn't touched her coffee. "You already understood what that line meant," Amara said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Celeste said quietly. "When did you understand it?" "The second week." Celeste looked at the folder. "The first week I kept thinking I was misreading it. That cleanable meant something else. That A was someone else." She paused. "But it kept fitting. Every time I tried to make it mean something different, it kept fitting the same way." Amara looked at the folder. "How much more is in here?" "A lot." Celeste reached across and turned to a section near the back. "This part is what made me call you specifically, and not go somewhere else first." The section she indicated was a series of handwritten notes from Jaemin, his handwriting, smaller, precise, and more precise than Kang-hyun's that appeared to document conversations. Not transcripts, but summaries, the kind of notes a careful man makes immediately after a meeting to record what was discussed. Poor memory softens it. 3 of the entries referenced Amara by name, not as a participant in the conversations, as a subject of them. The first discussion, AML's guarantee structure. KH wants documentation consolidated under single instrument to simplify management. I suggested this creates risk to her if structure comes under review. KH said risk is manageable. The second, dated 8 months later, KH raised question of whether A's signature on Meridian instruments could be characterized as knowing participation if examined externally. I said characterization would depend on framing. KH said keep options open. The third, dated 14 months ago, KH asked me directly whether the documentary record could be arranged to show AML as having directed the Meridian structure. I said technically possible. KH said don't do it yet, but understand the mechanism. Amara read all 3 entries. Then she closed the folder. She stood up, walked to the window, stood there with her arms at her sides, looking at the Manhattan, mourning the buildings, the sky, the street 23 floors below, and did what she always did when something required processing. She held it absolutely still inside herself until the initial wave of it passed, and she could see the shape clearly. This was not the grief of a woman who had been cheated on. This was not even the anger of a woman whose financial identity had been stolen. This was something she didn't have a ready name for, the specific devastation of understanding that a person you had loved and rescued and stood beside for 8 years had looked at you, specifically at your value and your capability and your willingness to help him, and had calculated how to use all of those things against you if it ever became necessary. He hadn't planned to destroy her. He had maintained the option, which was in its way colder, Miss Lennox. Celeste's voice was careful. Amara turned back from the window. "I'm all right. You don't have to be. I know." She came back to the table. She sat down. She picked up her coffee and drank it even though it had gone lukewarm. "Why are you bringing this to me, Celeste? Why not take it to your own attorney first?" Celeste looked at her steadily. "Because I did take it to an attorney first. 2 weeks ago," she paused. "He told me that if I disclosed these documents through formal channels without first establishing a protective relationship with another interested party. My husband's organization would know about it before the ink was dry on the filing. And then I'd be alone. So, you came to me. I came to the one person in this situation who has more reason than I do to want the truth to come out, and who has the resources to make sure it comes out in a way that doesn't get buried. Amara looked at her for a long moment. Your attorney was right, she said. Leave the folder with me. Celeste nodded. She stood. She picked up her tote bag lighter now, and Amara walked her to the door. At the threshold, Celeste paused. Miss Lennox. She seemed to weigh something. My husband isn't a cruel man. I need you to know that. He's a weak one. There's a difference. I know the difference, Amara said. Celeste left. Amara closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen table, picked up her phone, and called Lenora. Lenora answered in 2 rings. I need you here, Amara said. Now, Lenora arrived in 40 minutes. She read through the folder in 22, which was fast. But Lenora read the way surgeons operated without wasting motion. She turned pages with the systematic steadiness of someone cataloging rather than reacting. And when she finished, she set the folder down and folded her hands on top of it and looked at Amara with the expression she reserved for situations that required recalibrating everything they'd discussed before. This changes the legal posture, Lenora said. I know. Significantly. I know, Lenora. The contingency note alone. Lenora touched the folder. If this is verified, and we need verification before we do anything with it, but if it verifies, then what we're looking at isn't just unauthorized use of your signature. It's documented consideration of framing you for financial crimes. The sentence was precise and clinical and landed exactly as heavily as it deserved to. He didn't do it, Amara said. The note says he told Jae-min not to execute. He told him not yet. That's not the same as not doing it. Not yet is a man who left the option on the table and continued running the structure underneath you. Amara was quiet. I need you to understand what this means for your approach, Lenora said. We came into this planning, a controlled unwind strategic, protective of innocent employees, designed to create accountability without causing collateral damage. This approach assumed we were dealing with a man who had allowed something to happen through negligence and entitlement. And now? Now we're dealing with documentation that suggests deliberate preservation of an option to harm you legally. Lenora looked at her directly. That's a different kind of opponent, Amara. Splitting. And it requires us to decide, before we take another step, whether we're still protecting him from consequences he doesn't deserve, or whether we're protecting you from consequences that were being maintained for you. The apartment was quiet. Outside, a truck moved to the street below, its sound rising and then fading. Amara sat at her kitchen table in the morning light and felt the full weight of the decision sitting in front of her like a physical object. She had entered the walk out of the estate, the envelope, the frozen guarantees with one clear internal commitment. She would not destroy what didn't need to be destroyed. She would not burn innocent people's livelihoods to the ground because her husband had failed her. She would be accountable, strategic, controlled. What Celeste Kwan had just brought into this apartment was the information that Kang-hyun had not extended her the same courtesy. He had maintained the means to destroy her while she was protecting him. I need an hour, Amara said. Lenora nodded. I'll be in the other room. She left. Amara sat alone. She did not cry. She was not, she realized, going to cry about this, not because she wasn't capable of it, splitsing, but because somewhere in the last 3 days she had passed through the place where tears were the appropriate response to what she was feeling, and come out the other side into something quieter and more definite. She thought about the second rescue, the hostile acquisition attempt. 4 months of work, the subsidiaries that was still operating today because of what she had done. She thought about the specific meeting at which Kang-hyun had thanked her, privately, in the car on the way home, when it was over. She remembered that he had held her hand across the center console and said that he didn't know what he would have done without her. She wondered, now, whether in that same period, while she was spending 4 months saving his business, there had already been conversations with Jae-min about the meridian structure. Sound Meridian whether the warm weight of his hand in the car had been simultaneous with the early architecture of what Celeste's documents described. She thought it probably had been. And that thought was the one that finally settled something inside her, not into anger, not into grief, but into a clear, cold, structural decision. She picked up her phone. She called a number she hadn't dialed in 2 years. It rang 4 times before a man's voice answered, cautious Lennox. It's Amara. I need to talk to you about voluntary disclosure. David Rice had been a federal financial crimes prosecutor for 12 years before moving to private practice. Amara had worked with his firm on compliance matters 3 years ago. He was meticulous, careful, and had a specific reputation for distinguishing between the people who built criminal financial structures and the people those structures had been built around. She needed that distinction very badly right now. Can you come to me today? She asked. What time? He said, while Amara was making calls. 11 blocks away, Kang-hyun was sitting in his car outside the building, where Jae-min Kwon lived, holding a phone with a set of messages on the screen that had arrived in the last 40 minutes, and which he had read 3 times, trying to locate the exact moment where control of this situation had become something other than his. The messages were from Hyun-soo. Park Hyun-soo, who had been with Black Harbor for 9 years, who had attended the Sunday lunch at the estate, who had watched Amara leave, and then watched Kang-hyun read the envelope, and who had spent Sunday night making calculations of his own. The messages said, I heard from Jae-min. I know about the structure. I know what the contingency note says. This needs to be resolved before it gets to people who will resolve it differently than we want. And then, an hour later, I am not the only one who heard from Jae-min last night. Kang-hyun sat with those words. Jae-min had been talking. Not to Amara, not yet, as far as he could determine. But to the people inside Black Harbor's inner structure who now understood that the organization's financial architecture had a critical liability, and that the liability was connected to the boss's wife, who had just walked out of the estate with 8 years of financial leverage in her name. They were not loyal to Kang-hyun in the way he'd believed they were. They were loyal to the organization's survival, and if they determined that the organization's survival required separating from him, from his decisions, from his contingency notes, from his maintained options, they would do that with exactly the same efficiency with which they did everything else. He called Jae-min, no answer. He called again, voicemail. He called Hyun-soo. Where is Jae-min? He asked, before Hyun-soo could speak. Silence on the other end. The specific silence of a man deciding how much to say. Hyun-soo, I don't know, Hyun-soo said. He wasn't at his apartment this morning. His wife isn't answering either. The cold thread from Sunday night was back, sharper now. What do you know? Kang-hyun asked. Another pause. Longer. I know that Jae-min kept records you didn't know about. I know that his wife found them. And I know that Celeste Kwon's car was seen this morning in the West 50s. The West 50s, where Amara's apartment was. Kang-hyun sat in his car outside Jae-min's building and understood, with the precision of a man whose professional life had been built on reading situations correctly, that the timeline of what he'd thought was a manageable crisis had just accelerated past the point where management was possible in the way he'd been imagining. Celeste had given Amara whatever Jae-min had kept. Amara now had the contingency note. She knew what cleanable meant. Called her. 6 rings. Voicemail. He sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the street in front of him and felt for possibly the first time in 15 years the specific and unfamiliar sensation of being completely without a move. Every previous crisis in his professional life had had a next action. Call to make, a person to bring in, a structure to invoke, a resource to deploy. The machinery of the organization had always provided him a direction to move in, even when the direction was difficult. The resource he had always deployed in his hardest moments was Amara. And Amara was the crisis. He drove back to the office. 2:15 in the afternoon, Amara sat across from David Rice in Lenora's conference room, with Lenora beside her, and the Kwon folder open on the table, and she laid out the complete picture, the obsidian meridian structure, the signature appropriation, the contingency note, The Kwan records in the precise, chronological, evidence-grounded way she had spent an hour organizing before he arrived. David Rizes listened without interrupting. He was 57, compact, with the kind of face that had learned to withhold reaction as a professional tool. He took 3 pages of notes. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment, and then at her. "You understand that voluntary disclosure changes your position completely," he said. "That's why I'm here. It also means you cannot control what happens to him afterward." "I know. You've been protecting him financially for 8 years. Once you disclose, I know what it means, David." She said it without sharpness, just with the weight of someone who has done on the math and arrived at an answer they don't like and have decided to live with it anyway. "I'm not doing this to hurt him. I'm doing it because the alternative is waiting for him to decide whether or not to use that note against me. And I'm not willing to wait." David Rice looked at her for a moment. "If we move on voluntary disclosure, we need to move fast. The moment this becomes something other than your initiative, if another party discloses first, or if the structure comes under examination through a different channel, your protective positioning disappears." "How fast?" "Days, not weeks." Amara looked at Lenora. Lenora looked back at her. "Then we move," Amara said. David Rice nodded and closed his notepad. He was already reaching for his phone. At 4:47 that afternoon, a message was delivered to Kang-hyun through his attorney. It was a formal legal notice. Amara Lennox, acting through counsel, was initiating a voluntary disclosure process with relevant financial regulatory authorities regarding transactions associated with the Obsidian Meridian holding structure. The disclosure was being made proactively in full and was accompanied by documentation separating Ms. Lennox's authorized financial activities from transactions made without her knowledge or consent. A copy of the notice had been provided to Black Harbor's corporate legal team simultaneously. Kang-hyun read it standing in his office. He read it twice. Then he set it on his desk and looked out at the harbor and understood that the last controlled moment in this situation had been Sunday afternoon, when he had walked into that room with Yuna at his side and looked at his wife across 12 feet of family space and decided in 2 seconds, the 2-second look, that she was someone he no longer needed to regard. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about most of it. But he was standing in his office holding the evidence of what being wrong had cost, and the cost was not abstract anymore. His phone was ringing. His attorney, his uncle, Yunsu. 3 numbers at once. He did not answer any of them. He stood at the window while his phone rang and rang in his hand, and he thought about Amara in the car on the way home from the hostile acquisition resolution and the way she'd looked when he held her hand, tired, satisfied, still sharp at the edges even when she was exhausted, and he thought about the moment he had looked at her across that dining room table on Sunday and turned away. The phone stopped ringing. Then it started again. He answered. It was not his attorney or his uncle or Hunsu. It was Yuna. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have told you before today." Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before, not fear exactly, but the particular tension of someone who has been holding something they know they should have released sooner and has finally run out of time. Kang-hyun. Her voice was barely above a steady murmur. "I was there when the contingency note was written." The office went very quiet around him. "What did you say?" he asked. "I was at the meeting. The one where Jae-min and Dae-won discussed the documentation options. I was in the room." A pause that lasted long enough that he could hear her breathing. "I didn't know you didn't know I was there. I thought I assumed you knew everything that was discussed." "I didn't know you were there," he said. His voice was perfectly flat. "I know that now. What else was discussed?" Silence. Yuna. The flatness in his voice had an edge under it, now not raised, not loud, but with the specific weight of a man who has reached the boundary of what he can absorb. "What else was in that meeting?" she told him, and as she spoke, Kang-hyun stood at his office window with the city light failing outside, and understood that the person who had built the architecture that was now dismantling everything he'd spent 15 years constructing was not Amara, was not Jae-min, was not his uncle. It was the convergence of every decision he himself had made and had told himself was manageable. Every option he'd left open, everything he'd chosen not to examine too carefully because examining it would have required him to do something about it. The harbor outside his window was going dark. His empire was not burning, it was dissolving quietly, at the foundations, in the methodical and legally precise way that only someone who knew exactly where the foundations were could manage. Amara knew exactly where they were. She had built them. And now with Celeste Kwan's folder and David Rice's expertise and Lenora Quaid's legal precision, she was going to do what he had never once, in 8 years of watching her, save everything around her, imagined she would do. She was going to let the truth come out, not to destroy him. To make certain that when it came out, and it was coming out, there was no version of the next 72 hours where it didn't her name would be on the right side of it. He ended the call with Yuna. He stood alone in his office, with his phone at his side, and the legal notice on his desk, and the city going dark outside, and he felt the full architecture of what he had built, and what he had allowed, and what he had made its options settle, round him like the walls of a room that had always been exactly this size, and which he was only now standing still long enough to measure. The notice hit Black Harbor's corporate legal team at 4:47 on a Monday afternoon, and by 5:30 the building was running on a different kind of energy than it had ever run on before. Not panic. Panic was loud and visible and created witnesses. Splitting. What moved through the upper floors of Black Harbor's Manhattan headquarters in the 90 minutes after the notice arrived was something quieter and more dangerous than controlled. Rapid reorientation of people who understood that the ground had shifted and were calculating, each of them separately, what that shift meant for their specific position. Kang-hyun knew this because he had spent 15 years being the person those calculations were made around. He recognized the signs, the attorney who took 11 minutes to return a call instead of 2. The associate who appeared in his doorway with a question that was really an assessment. The slight recalibration in how his assistant held herself when she brought him the printed copy of the disclosure notes, not the deference of before, but the careful neutrality of someone who has decided not to commit to a sinking ship before she knows the rate of descent. He read the notice 3 times. By the 3rd reading, he understood something that the first 2 readings had obscured because he'd been reading it as a legal document rather than as a communication from Amara. She had structured the disclosure to be protective of innocent parties first, the legitimate employees, the subsidiary structures that had nothing to do with Obsidian Meridian. She had taken the time, in the middle of building a case against the financial architecture that bore her name without her consent, to ensure that the dismantling didn't fall on people who hadn't been part of any decision. That was not the action of a woman who wanted to destroy him. It was the action of a woman who had decided that her own protection mattered more than his, and who was being honest about the distinction. He called his attorney and told him to prepare for a full internal audit disclosure. He called Daewon and said 4 words, "Come to the office." He sent Hyun-soo a message that said, "Don't talk to anyone outside this building tonight." Then he called Yuna back. She answered immediately. "I need everything," he said. "Every conversation you were present for. Every meeting. Every name tonight." A long pause. "Kang-hyun, if I do that. If you don't do it for me, you'll do it for investigators," he said. "Pick which conversation you want to have." She was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'll come to the office," she said. He ended the call. He stood at his desk and looked at the harbor, dark now, the city lights reflecting off the water in the specific fractured way that water always breaks light, never clean, never whole. Always scattered into something that looks like the original from a distance, but is entirely different up close. He had built his organization on the understanding that information was currency. You held it, controlled it, released it strategically. You never let a situation develop where someone else controlled more of the relevant information than you did. Amara had just demonstrated that she had been holding more of it than him for years. Not because she had hidden it from him, because he had handed it to her and stopped paying attention. The meeting that night started at 8 and ran past midnight. 7 people in the Black Harbor conference room: Kang-hyun, Daewon, Hyun-soo, the corporate attorney, Marcus Leith, 2 financial compliance advisors, and Yuna, who arrived last and sat at the far end of the table with the careful posture of a woman who understood that her presence in this room was both necessary and not entirely safe. Marcus Leith ran the first hour. He was thorough and efficient, and delivered the legal landscape without softening it. Voluntary disclosure by a primary created an obligation for the organization to cooperate fully or face a significantly worse regulatory posture. The choice in front of them was not whether to cooperate, but how comprehensively and how quickly. "What's her ask?" Hyun-soo asked. "She hasn't made one yet," Leith said. "The notice is disclosure of intent. The terms come in the next communication." "Then we wait," Hyun-soo said. "We don't wait," Kang-hyun said. Everyone looked at him. Waiting means she sets the terms unilaterally. "We go to her." Leith shifted in his chair, Kang-hyun strategically approaching her before she makes a formal demand. "I know what it looks like," Kang-hyun said. "Do it anyway." Leith made a note. Daewon had been quiet through most of the first hour. He sat at the table with the deliberate stillness of a man conserving energy, and when he finally spoke, it was with a directness that surprised the room. "I want to say something," Daewon said. Kang-hyun looked at him. "I knew about the contingency note," Daewon said. Not to the room, to Kang-hyun specifically, directly, with the particular quality of an old man saying something he has been carrying long enough that the weight has finally exceeded the value of silence. "I knew what it said. I knew what Jaemin understood it to mean. And I said nothing, because I believed I convinced myself that it was a theoretical protection that would never need to be used." The room was absolutely still. "I want that on record," Daewon said. "Within this room, before we talk to anyone outside it. I'm responsible for that silence. Not Kang-hyun alone." Kang-hyun looked at his uncle for a long moment. "It was my note," Kang-hyun said. "It was your note," Daewon agreed. "And I knew about it and said nothing." "That's a different thing. But it's not nothing." Another silence. "All right," Leith said carefully. "We document that." Internally, he made another note. "Now Yuna." He turned to the far end of the table. "We need to understand exactly what you observed, and when." Yuna's hands were flat on the table. She had dressed for this meeting the way you dress when you know you're going to be examined. Nothing that could be read as aggressive or apologetic, just clean and controlled and present. "I was at 2 meetings," she said. "The first was approximately 20 months ago. Jaemin, Daewon, and Kang-hyun were present. The discussion concerned the meridian structure and its regulatory exposure. I was there because I had introduced Kang-hyun to one of the offshore intermediaries, a contact from my prior work in international finance. I wasn't a participant in the financial decisions. I was context." "And the second meeting?" Leith asked. 14 months ago, smaller. Just Jaemin and Kang-hyun. I was waiting in an adjacent room and the door was partially open." She paused. "I heard Jaemin say that the signature documentation could be arranged to indicate directed participation rather than incidental authorization. I heard Kang-hyun say to leave it as an available option." She delivered all of this in the measured cadence of someone who has rehearsed it enough that the emotional content has been separated from the informational content, and what comes out is just the information, clean and precise. Kang-hyun was looking at the table. "And you didn't tell me you'd heard that," he said. "No. Why?" Yuna was quiet for a moment, "Because I had already thought I cared about you, and telling you that I'd heard something that implicated you in a potential criminal posture seemed like the kind of thing that ended relationships." The room absorbed that. "And now?" Kang-hyun asked. "Now ending the relationship seems like significantly less of a problem than the alternative." At 10 the next morning, Amara was in Lenora's conference room when the call came through. Marcus Leith, representing Black Harbor's corporate entities, requesting a meeting within 48 hours. He was professional, neutral his words, and chose his with the careful precision of someone who understood that everything said in this call could eventually be repeated in a less comfortable setting. Amara listened. She let him finish his complete request before responding. "Tomorrow," she said. 2 o'clock, our location. Leith said he would confirm. She ended the call and looked at Lenora. "He called," Lenora said. It wasn't surprise. He called. Amara confirmed. David Rice was at the other end of the table, reviewing the preliminary disclosure documentation. He looked up. They're moving fast. That's either panic or strategy. It's Kang-hyun, Amara said. It's strategy. He's decided that waiting is worse than approaching. Is he right? Amara considered. He's right that waiting is worse. He's wrong if he thinks approaching changes the fundamental position. What's your goal for tomorrow? David asked. Amara looked at the table. She looked at the folder from Celeste Kwan, which was now in a clear evidence sleeve at the center of the table. She looked at the preliminary disclosure documents that bore her name and her attorney's signatures and David Rice's professional endorsement. She thought about what she wanted, not what she wanted to happen to Kang-hyun. Not revenge, not punishment, not the particular satisfaction of watching someone who had underestimated her understand the size of their mistake. She had thought about those things and found they didn't hold. They were the emotions of the first hours, and the first hours were over. What she wanted was structural. I want separation, she said. Complete, documented, legally enforced separation between my financial identity and every Black Harbor entity. I want independent oversight of the legitimate businesses going forward so that innocent employees are protected without my involvement. I want the corporate record corrected. I want what I did for that organization acknowledged in its actual history, not erased from it. She paused. And I want out of this marriage in a way that is clean, complete, and does not leave me vulnerable to anything Jae-min built into that documentation. And the disclosure process itself? David asked. Continues regardless of what they offer, she said. I'm not using the disclosure as leverage. I'm proceeding with it because it's the right thing to do and because the alternative is sitting on information that implicates me in something I didn't do and waiting to see whether they use it. That's not leverage. That's just finished. David Rice nodded slowly. Then tomorrow we listen to what they propose, and then we tell them what we require. The meeting the next afternoon was held in Lenora's firm's main conference room, 22nd floor, Midtown, with a view that was deliberately chosen to be neutral in the specific way that a room that belongs to neither party can create a geographic advantage for the party that hosts it. Amara arrived 20 minutes early. She wore a charcoal suit, flat shoes, no jewelry except her watch, the one she had purchased for herself, with the first bonus she had received from her own investment work, before the marriage, before Black Harbor, before any of this. She wore it as the only object on her body that had no story attached to it except her own. Lenora was beside her. David Rice was on her left. Marcus Leith arrived at 1:58 with 2 associates and a financial compliance advisor. Kang-hyun arrived at 2:00 exactly. He was alone. That was not what she had expected. She had expected him to bring his infrastructure, his people, his advisors, the physical expression of the organization's weight in the room. Instead, he walked in, behind Leith in a dark suit with no associate at his side, and sat down across from her, and looked at her directly for the first time since the estate. Not a 2-second look this time. He held it. She held it back. Leith opened. He was smooth and prepared, and laid out Black Harbor's position in the formal language of legal negotiation. The organization acknowledged certain irregularities in the Obsidian Meridian structure, was prepared to cooperate fully with all relevant regulatory processes, and was seeking a collaborative resolution framework that protected all legitimate interests. Lenora let him finish. Then she opened the folder and placed 6 documents in the center of the table, evenly spaced, and identified each one with a single sentence. The guarantee structure documentation, the Meridian instrument analysis, the signature appropriation evidence, the Kwan records, the contingency note, and the preliminary disclosure filing. Our client has already initiated disclosure, Lenora said. That process is not contingent on this meeting. This meeting exists to determine whether the resolution of the broader situation can be accomplished in a way that is orderly and complete, or whether it has to be accomplished piece by piece through regulatory processes alone. Leith said, we understand that. Then let's discuss what orderly and complete looks like, Lenora said. The next 40 minutes were technical financial terms, legal structures, the architecture of what cooperation required and what separation entailed. A sound like green wood splitting, Amara participated in the technical with the precision of someone who understood every number being discussed better than half the people in the room, which she did, which was why she was able to stop Leith's compliance advisor mid-sentence at one point and say, "That characterization of the collateral structure is incorrect, and be right," demonstrably and immediately, which created a brief silence before the advisor corrected himself. Kang-hyun watched this and said nothing. He had said almost nothing since the meeting began. When the technical portion reached the question of the contingency note, the cleanable notation, the framing option that had been discussed and maintained, Leith moved to characterize it as a theoretical discussion that had never been actioned. "It was documented," David Rice said flatly, "in your own financial architect's handwriting. The documentation of intent is the issue, not just the action." The intent, David said, to maintain the option of framing my client for financial crimes she did not commit, is not a minor characterization issue. It is the reason my client has chosen voluntary disclosure rather than waiting to see whether that option was ultimately exercised. The room went quiet. Kang-hyun looked at David Rice. Then he looked at Amara. "Can I speak?" he said. Not to Leith. To Amara. Lenora looked at Amara. Amara gave a small nod. "Directly," Kang-hyun said, without the attorneys translating. "They stay in the room," Amara said. "I know." He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table. "The note was mine. I wrote it. The discussion with Jamin about the documentation option was one I allowed. I did not instruct him to execute it, but I maintained it as an available mechanism, and I did that while knowing that the underlying structure had been built using your financial identity without your authorization." He stopped. "I am not going to tell you that I didn't know what I was doing. I knew what I was doing. I told myself it was management of risk. It wasn't. The room was absolutely still. What was it?" Amara asked. Her voice was level, no heat in it. He looked at her directly. "It was entitlement. I convinced myself that because you had always been there, because you had always been the person who solved the problem, that your resources were part of the problem-solving architecture, that they were available because you were available. I stopped distinguishing between what you chose to do and what I assumed you would do. And the note. The note was insurance I told myself I'd never need because I believed you would always choose to protect what we'd built." A pause. "I believed you wouldn't let it fall apart, even if I gave you reason to." Something crossed her face that wasn't softening. It was the opposite, actually. A hardening of a specific kind. The kind that comes when you hear an explanation that is honest and complete and changes nothing about what is required. "You were right that I wouldn't let innocent people's livelihoods fall apart," she said. "You were wrong that it had anything to do with protecting you." He absorbed that, "I know," he said. "The note exists," she said. "The option you maintained exists. The fact that you didn't execute it is noted. It doesn't undo 8 years of building something I was invisible inside, and it doesn't undo the fact that you maintained the means to harm me while I was protecting you." Her voice was still level. It was the most controlled and most devastating version of what she could have said, and he knew it, and the room knew it. "What I need from you now is not an explanation. I have the explanation. What I need is cooperation." She looked at Leith. "The terms are in Lenora's document. Independent financial oversight for all legitimate entities. Removal of Jahimin and anyone else with knowledge of the Meridian structure from all positions of financial authority. Full documentary cooperation with the disclosure process. Correction of the corporate record and divorce." Leith looked at Kang-hyun. Kang-hyun did not look at his attorney. He kept his eyes on Amara. "Yes," he said. Leith blinked. "Kang-hyun, we should review." Marcus, his voice was quiet and final. "Yes." The agreement in principle was reached by 5:30 that evening. It was not the end of the process. The disclosure would take weeks to complete. The corporate restructuring would take months. The divorce settlement required its own separate legal process. But the framework was established, and with the framework established, the decisions that could spiral into something uncontrolled were contained. Amara walked out of Lenora's building at 5:47 into late afternoon air that had the particular quality of November in New York, cold and direct, and not especially interested in how you felt about it. Lenora walked out beside her. That went better than I expected, Lenora said. He made a decision before he came in, Amara said. He decided that fighting me was worse than cooperating. It was a practical decision. You sound almost don't, Amara said. Lenora was quiet. They stood at the building entrance, for a moment, the city moving around them, at its ordinary indifferent pace. What now? Lenora asked. Now the disclosure process runs, Amara said. David manages the regulatory engagement. You manage the corporate separation. I manage my own finances and stay out of Black Harbor's business entirely. And him? Amara thought about Kang-hyun sitting across that table. The way he'd looked at her when he said entitlement. The way he'd said yes, without consulting his attorney, which was either the most honest thing he'd done in years or the strategic capitulation of a man who'd already lost the calculation and knew it. Possibly both. With him, possibly both at the same time. He'll survive it, she said. He's survived everything else through intelligence and adaptation. He'll survive this the same way. She started walking toward the car. That's no longer my concern, she meant it. But meaning something and feeling the full weight of it were, she was learning, processes that ran on different timetables. She meant it at 5:47 on a Tuesday in November. She would still mean it at 9 that evening, when she was back in the apartment and the legal documents were arranged on her kitchen table and the folder from Celeste Kwan was in a secure evidence envelope waiting for handoff to David's firm. And she would mean it at 11:30, when she was lying in the dark listening to the city outside and feeling the specific and particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down, but whose arms still remember the weight. She meant it. The rest would take the time it took. The following morning, Jae-min Kwan walked into a downtown legal office at 9 a.m. and sits himself, and a full set of documentary records to a team of attorneys who had been expecting him. He had called ahead. He had called ahead because the previous 48 hours had demonstrated to him, with clarity, that the trajectory of this situation had only one survivable version for someone in his position, and survivable required being first. Celeste had not come home. He had discovered this on Monday evening when he returned to find the apartment empty in the particular way that means considered and deliberate, rather than temporary specific things missing, others left. A sound like green documents she'd copied. She had left the originals, which told him she'd understood the legal architecture of what she was doing and had structured her exit accordingly. He sat in his empty apartment for 2 hours. Then he called his attorney. The attorney told him what David Rice had already told Amara. The window for being first was closing, and first was the only position that carried protection. He spent the night assembling records. In the morning, he went downtown. By Thursday, the shape of the Obsidian Meridian dissolution was clear enough that Black Harbor's corporate communications team issued an internal statement to legitimate company staff. The organization was undergoing a financial restructuring process. Independent oversight was being implemented, and all employment arrangements within the legitimate business entities remained protected. The statement had been drafted with Amara's input, not because Leith or Kang-hyun had asked her, because she had sent a draft to Leith on Wednesday morning and said, "This is what needs to be said to the employees, and this is the accurate version of it." And Leith, after consulting with Kang-hyun, had used it almost verbatim. She had not asked for acknowledgement. She knew it would get done correctly if she wrote it, and she needed it done correctly. And the simplest path between those 2 points was to write it herself. Old habits. The difference was that this time she knew it was an old habit, and chose to exercise it anyway, which was different from not knowing, and different from thinking she owed it to anyone. She did it because 540 people were still employed in businesses that existed because of decisions she'd made, and she cared about that. Not about the credit, not about Kang-hyun's reaction to receiving the draft. Just about the 540 people, most of whom had never known her name. On Friday afternoon, Dae-won came to see her. She hadn't invited him. She hadn't expected him. He called from the lobby of her building and asked if she had 20 minutes, and she says yes because she was curious what he had to say, and she'd always believed that curiosity, carefully managed, was worth more than avoidance. He came up alone. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, where she'd sat with Celeste Kwan 4 days earlier, and for a moment he just looked at her with the tired, specific expression of a man who has arrived at a conversation that needed to happen years ago and is aware of the distance between then and now. "I should have told you," he said. 2 years ago when I found the irregularities. I should have come to you directly." "Yes," she said. "I told myself it was protecting the family." "I know." "It wasn't." "No," she said. "It was protecting your position inside the family." There's a difference. He absorbed that without flinching, which she respected. "I want you to know," he said, "that I intend to cooperate with everything the disclosure process requires." "Fully. Not strategically. Fully, I know," she said. Marcus Leith confirmed that Wednesday. "I'm not here because of the legal process," he said. "I'm here because you deserve to hear it from me." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "I hear it." He nodded. He stood. He moved toward the door, and at the threshold he stopped and looked back at her with the expression that she'd always read as warmth and had eventually learned was calculation, and which now, in this moment, was something more complicated than either. "You were always the right person in that organization," he said. "I need you to know that I knew that. You knew my value," she said. "That's not the same thing." He stood with that for a moment. Then he left. She closed the door. She went back to the kitchen table and sat down with the current draft of the divorce settlement terms and worked through the financial provisions. For the next 3 hours, marking the sections that required revision and the sections that were acceptable and the sections near the end that concerned the corporate history correction, the documentation that would formally acknowledge, within Black Harbor's legitimate records, the financial contributions that had been made by Amara Lennox during 3 periods of organizational crisis. That section she read twice, not with satisfaction, with the specific and complicated feeling of someone receiving accurate documentation of something they lived through, which is not the same as receiving justice and not the same as receiving nothing, but is somewhere in between the acknowledgement of what happened in writing by the people who had benefited from it for years. It was imperfect. Most things that were real were imperfect. She marked the section as acceptable and kept working. The settlement meeting that brought the legal framework from principle to paper was held 12 days after the Tuesday conference room session in a neutral location that both attorneys had agreed on, a formal conference facility in Midtown that existed specifically for mediations and had been designed to be comfortable for no one. Both parties attended, Amara and Lenora on one side, Kang-hyun and Leith on the other. The session ran 6 hours. Most of it was technical and procedural, the language of legal separation, the transfer of financial instruments, the establishment of the independent oversight structure, the timeline for the corporate record correction. Amara participated in every section. She asked 12 questions during the morning session and 7 during the afternoon, all of them specific and all of them requiring precise answers before she would move to the next item. At one point, Kang-hyun looked at her across the table while she was dissecting a proposed oversight mechanism clause, and something crossed his face that was not performance and not strategy. It was the unguarded expression of a man watching someone he underestimated demonstrate, again, the full scope of what that underestimation had cost. She noticed. She didn't stop working. At 4:15, the final section was reached. The divorce terms. It was the shortest section and the one that had required the least negotiation, because neither party had the energy or the inclination to fight over it. The financial separation had been done carefully. The asset division was equitable and specific. The settlement provisions compensated Amara for the documented unauthorized use of her financial guarantees in a way that was substantial without being designed as punishment. Kang-hyun signed everything that was put in front of him. When the last document was signed, the mediator collected the pages, and Leith and David Rice began the process of organizing copies. Kang-hyun stood. Amara stood. They were 6 feet apart across a conference table with 6 hours of legal work between them. And for a moment there was nothing particular to do, no document to review, no clause to contest, no position to defend. He looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it without lethe, without context, without the surrounding structure of legal language. Just those two words in his own voice, direct. She looked at him. She thought about 8 years. She thought about the first rescue, and the second, and the third. She thought about the car and the hand across the center console. Thought about the afternoon. She thought about the Sunday and the 2-second look in the estate's dining room table with the ring on an envelope. She thought about the contingency note, and the word cleanable, and the cold architecture of options maintained. "I know," she said. "Not, it's all right. Not, I forgive you. Not, I understand. Just, I know." She picked up her bag, nodded to Lenora, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. In the elevator, going down, Lenora stood beside her in silence. At the lobby, before the doors opened, Lenora said, "You okay?" Amara thought about the question with the honest attention it deserved. "No," she said, "not yet, the doors opened. But I will be," she said. And she walked out into the city, which was cold and indifferent and completely uninterested in what she had just survived, and which was in that particular moment, after that particular day, exactly what she needed. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in late January, and the day itself had no weather worth remembering. Gray. Cold in the way January in New York is cold, not dramatic, not punishing, just a steady and impersonal pressure that had been there for weeks and would be there for weeks more, entirely indifferent to anything happening at street level. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission to be present. It is simply there, and you move through it or you don't. Amara moved through it. She arrived at the courthouse at 10:40, 20 minutes early, because she had always arrived early to things that mattered, and she saw no reason to change that now. Lenora was already in the lobby, with 2 cups of coffee from the place across the street, the decent but unremarkable place. The one with uncomfortable chairs, and handed one to Amara without a word, which was the correct response to the moment, and which Amara accepted with a nod that communicated everything the moment required. They went upstairs. The room was what these rooms always were, functional, fluorescent lit, designed for procedure rather than human ease. A long table, a court officer with a stack of documents, a water-stained ceiling tile in the far left corner that Amara found herself looking at periodically throughout the proceedings, not because it was interesting, but because looking at something imperfect and ordinary helped her stay anchored when the weight of everything she was signing tried to pull her attention inward and backward and into the specific gravity of 8 years. She signed the last document at 11:14 in the morning. Her hand was steady. She had expected something different in the weeks leading up to this, had expected some large emotional event to accompany the legal finality of it. She had prepared for that. She had given herself permission for it, which was something Lenora had told her to do. You are allowed to fall apart when it's over, so don't waste energy on not falling apart before then. What arrived instead was not large. It was dense and quiet, a compressed heaviness that occupied the chest without announcing itself. The specific weight of a person who has been in a sustained state of operational high functioning for 2.5 months and has just been handed a piece of paper that says, the acute portion is complete. The machinery that has been keeping you functional can now downshift. The body doesn't immediately believe paperwork. She stood. She handed the pen back to the court officer. She looked at Lenora. Lenora put one hand briefly on her shoulder, not a full gesture, not an embrace, just a touch, the specific physical communication of someone who understands that words are insufficient, and presence is more honest than performance. Amara nodded. They walked out. In the elevator, going down, she looked at her own reflection in the polished metal doors, distorted, imprecise, the kind of impression you get of yourself in a surface that isn't designed for clarity. She looked at it for the 4 floors of descent, and thought that this was probably the most accurate representation of where she was, not unclear, not lost, but not yet resolved into the clean image of what she was becoming. Still in process, still mid-translation between what she had been inside that marriage and what she was going to be outside of it. She could live with mid-translation. It was more honest than pretending she had already arrived. A coffee place across the street had 2 tables open near the window. They sat at the one with more light, which was Amara's preference that Lenora had learned years ago without being told. Cups from earlier were gone. They ordered again, and for a while, they simply sat Lenora checking messages on her phone, Amara watching the street through the glass, the city outside doing what the city always did, which was continue at its ordinary, indifferent pace, regardless of what had just been signed, 11 floors above it. David needs you next week, Lenora said eventually. The regulatory deposition. I know. I have it in my calendar. He wants a prep session Friday afternoon. 2 o'clock is fine. Lenora put her phone down. Amara, I'm all right. I didn't say you weren't. Amara looked at her. I know. You're asking anyway. I'm asking anyway. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms. She thought about the question with the genuine attention it deserved rather than the reflexive management it would have received from her 6 months earlier, when genuine attention to her own emotional state would have felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet, she said, but closer than I was this morning. Lenora accepted that, which was one of the things Amara valued most about her, the capacity to receive an incomplete answer without requiring it to be more complete than it actually was. They sat for another 20 minutes. Then Amara went back to work. The regulatory deposition 11 days later ran 4 hours in a federal building downtown, in a room designed with a particular institutional calculation of spaces, meant to remind participants that the proceedings inside them are consequential, and the room itself is not on anyone's side. Soraya Vance, the lead investigative counsel, was exactly what Amara had been told she would be: methodical, precise, unhurried in the way of someone who has all the time they need, because the documentation does most of the work for them, and they understand this. She asked questions in a sequence that built carefully from foundation to structure, to the specific load-bearing points where accountability was most concentrated. Amara answered everything. She had spent 2 sessions with David Rice preparing. Not for evasion, there was nothing to evade, but for precision. The distinction between what she had authorized and what had been done in her name without authorization in the entire deposition was the most critical line, and she drew it consistently, with specific dates and documentary references every time a question came near it. At the 2-hour mark, Vance looked up from her notes and said, "Miss Lennox, I want to ask you something directly." "All right. When you initiated voluntary disclosure before you had any legal obligation to do so, before any regulatory inquiry had been opened, what were you hoping to accomplish?" David Rice shifted slightly in his chair, not an objection, an awareness. Amara looked at Vance. "I was hoping to accomplish the accurate documentation of what had been done and who had done it," she said. Specifically, what transactions had occurred, how they had occurred, whose authorizations were genuine, and whose had been appropriated. I needed the record to be accurate before anyone else had the opportunity to make it inaccurate in a way that served their interests rather than the facts. You were concerned that the record might be arranged differently. I had documentary evidence that the arrangement of the record had been discussed as a contingency option, Amara said. That was sufficient reason not to wait. Vance made a note. "Were you acting to protect yourself?" she asked. "Yes," Amara said. Spioring and the people employed by the legitimate businesses who would have been collateral damage if the structure had collapsed without a managed resolution. Both of those things, simultaneously. They weren't in conflict with each other. Vance looked at her for a moment, the particular look of someone measuring the gap between what they expected and what they're receiving. "That's an unusual combination," Vance said. "I've spent 20 years being precise about financial structures," Amara said. "The precision doesn't turn off because the situation is personal." A brief silence. "No," Vance said, "I can see that." She moved to the next question. When the deposition concluded at 4:15 and Amara was walking out with David Rice into the hallway, he said, "The bit about precision not turning off, that was good." "It wasn't strategic," she said. "It was true." "Those are the best ones," he said. The consequences moved through the regulatory and legal system at the pace of institutional accountability, which was not the pace of fiction or of justice, as people imagined it, but was the pace of processes that needed to be durable rather than fast, and which, when they worked correctly, which they did not always do, but which in this case they did produce outcomes that held. Jae-min Kwon had gone first. His attorney had correctly calculated that first position carried the most protection, and Jae-min had spent the night after Celeste left assembling everything he had into a package that he walked through a downtown legal office door at 9 the following morning, with the specific posture of a man who has made his calculation and is now executing it without looking back at what the calculation cost. He cooperated fully. Every transaction, every conversation he could reconstruct, every document in the hidden system he had built over 5 years of working inside the spices between what Black Harbor's legitimate businesses said they were and what their financial architecture actually supported. The outcome stripped him of his license for 7 years, required substantial financial restitution into a protected employee fund, and removed him permanently from any position of financial authority within any entity connected to the Seo family or their affiliated organizations. He did not go to prison. Amara had complicated feelings about this and examined them honestly over the course of several evenings in February, sitting at her kitchen table after the day's work was done, and arrived at an acceptance that was not endorsement. The system had produced the outcome the system was designed to produce given the inputs. Jae-min had been first and had been comprehensive and had provided the documentary foundation that made every other accountability in the case possible, including her own protection. The systems had honored that. She disagreed with the weight of the outcome, but not with the process that produced it, and she understood, clearly, the difference between those two things. She filed her feelings in the appropriate internal folder. She moved on. Daewon's cooperation had been what he promised in her apartment that Friday full, not strategic, conducted with the methodical exhaustion of a man who has carried something long enough to understand that the carrying was the wrong choice and that putting it down, even publicly and at cost, was the only thing left that had any integrity in it. He was 61 years old and had spent 40 of those years inside the Seo family's organizational structure in one form or another. He had known the Meridian irregularities existed for 2 years before Amara found them. He had told himself it was loyalty, and later told himself it was protection, and later still in the deposition room, under Soraya Vance's specific and patient questions, he had said, in a voice that had the worn quality of someone who has run out of comfortable framings, that he had simply been afraid of what acknowledging it would cost him. The sanctions removed him from every position of authority, imposed significant financial penalties, and required ongoing cooperation with the oversight process for 3 years. He cooperated with everything. Amara did not see him again after the apartment conversation, which she had decided was the appropriate distance. He had said what he needed to say to her personally, and she had received it, and the legal process had received everything else, and there was nothing further that required them to occupy the same room. She did not wish him harm. She did not wish him anything in particular. He had simply become someone from a chapter she had closed, and she had enough real things in front of her not to spend energy looking backward at people she was done with. Yuna Beck gave her testimony in February. Amara was not present for it and did not request details beyond the summary David Rice provided. Yuna's account had corroborated the documentary record completely and had filled specific gaps in the chronology that the documents alone left ambiguous. She had been precise, she had been consistent under questioning, and she had volunteered several details about conversations she had witnessed that she had not been directly asked about the specific behavior of someone who had decided that partial cooperation was more dangerous than complete cooperation, and had made that decision before walking into the room. After her testimony, Yuna left New York. Amara heard, through Lenora, that she had returned to Seoul, where she had family and a professional network that predated her involvement with Kang-hyun. Whether she rebuilt something there, whether she found the kind of ordinary life that had apparently gotten complicated somewhere in the years she'd spent in proximity to Black Harbor's organizational world. Amara did not know and did not seek to find out. She hoped Yuna was all right. This surprised her slightly, the genuineness of it. She had expected to find, when she examined her feelings about Yuna, something harder, something closer to the clean boundary of resentment that would have been simpler to carry. What she found instead was a complicated and honest absence of hostility toward a woman who had been complicit in her humiliation but had ultimately, when it mattered, told the truth. That counted for something. Not for everything, but for something. Kang-hyun's accounting was the most complex and the one that took the longest to reach its conclusion. He occupied the position of a man who had directed something without leaving clean, explicit, criminal statute satisfying instructions, who had built the architecture of culpability through conversations and maintained options, and the particular organizational gravity of being the person whose comfort level determines what his people understand to be permissible. Soraya Vance's team spent 3 months with his file. The contingency note was significant. The documented conversations were significant. His admitted awareness of the meridian structure and the signature appropriation was significant. His failure to correct the situation when he became fully aware of its dimensions was significant. Against this, his full cooperation with the disclosure process. The fact that he had not executed the contingency option. The fact that he had, in the settlement meeting, accepted every term presented to him without negotiation or legal resistance. A sound green wood splitting. The fact that he had come to that meeting alone without his organizational infrastructure and had spoken directly to Amara in a way that no attorney had scripted because no attorney would have recommended it. The investigators had spent 3 months with the file and had produced an outcome that was, like all outcomes, shaped by institutional process applied to human complexity, imperfect and real. Significant financial penalties, personal liability, for a substantial portion of the restitution fund, payment of which would take years and would require him to liquidate assets he had spent a decade accumulating. Removal from executive leadership of all Black Harbor entities for a minimum of 5 years. A formal supervisory agreement requiring ongoing cooperation with oversight and prohibition from certain categories of financial decision-making within any business he was associated with. No criminal charges. The threshold had not been met. The evidence was substantial, but the execution of harm had not occurred, and the cooperation had been genuine and early enough to carry weight, and the investigator, that the accountability structure would produce more lasting result than a contested prosecution that carried uncertainty. Amara read the determination on the evening it was issued. She sat at her kitchen table with the document open on her laptop and read it twice, which was her habit with important documents. Once for the information, once for the shape of the information, the way things were arranged relative to each other. She sat with it for the rest of the evening. She had not wanted him in prison. She had examined this honestly in herself months ago, and had found it to be true not because she had forgiven him, not because the contingency note had stopped being what it was, but because she had looked at what she wanted and found that it was specific and structural rather than punitive. She had wanted her name protected. She had wanted the record corrected. She had wanted separation that was complete. She had wanted the innocent employees protected. She had wanted the truth documented by the people who knew it. All of those things had happened. The determination was imperfect, and she sat with the imperfection of it, the way you sit with an imperfect outcome that is also a real one without pretending. It was what you might have designed in a system with no constraints, and without dismissing the fact that the constraints were real and the outcome within them was the best available. She filed it in the appropriate folder. She made herself dinner, something she had started doing again in January, actually cooking rather than ordering, a small domestic reassertion of presence in her own life. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept adequately. In the morning, she went back to work. Corporate record correction was finalized in March. Not a public announcement, not a press release designed for visibility. A formal internal amendment to the historical documentation of 3 of Black Harbor's legitimate entities, the fabrication company, the shipping subsidiary, and the hospitality management group that had each, at different points in the previous 8 years, survived crisis periods because of decisions Amara had made and resources she had committed. The amendment named her. It specified amounts and mechanisms and the professional expertise deployed. It used the word architect in its description of her role during the second crisis, the hostile acquisition attempt. 4 months of work because the settlement agreement had required accuracy, and accuracy in that case required the word that actually applied. Kang-hyun had authorized the amendment. His attorney had sent the authorization to Leith, who had sent it to Lenora, who had sent it to Amara with a note that said simply signed. No revisions requested. Amara read this at her desk at Lennox Meridian's office on a Tuesday morning in late March. She sat with it for a few minutes. She had needed this not for pride, not for vindication in any theatrical sense, but because the accurate record was a practical protection. In a world where people sometimes tried to rewrite the history of what had happened in rooms they controlled, the documented version mattered. Seinrich Fastens, the version that lived in official records and who were now required to acknowledge it, had a durability that memory and word of mouth and reputation did not. She had needed it to exist. Now it existed. She printed a copy and filed it in a physical folder in the top drawer of her desk, which she kept locked, alongside the settlement agreement and the preliminary disclosure documents and the divorce decree. The things that were most important she kept on paper, in a drawer, in a room she controlled. Old habits from the rescue. Years always keep the original. Lennox Meridian Capital opened its doors formally in early April, in a space she had chosen for its light and its workability, rather than its impressiveness. An office in a building, in Midtown, that had good bones and large windows, and enough room for the team she was building, without the kind of square footage that would communicate ambition before results had earned it. She had named the fund deliberately Lennox, because it was her name, and she was done putting other people's names on things she built. Meridian, because she had chosen to take the word back, to remove it from its association with the offshore structure that had used it as a vehicle for concealment, and give it to something that would use it as a vehicle for exactly the opposite. A meridian is a line of position, a reference point, the thing from which you calculate where everything else is. She intended it as precisely that. The capital base came from the divorce settlement, from her own accumulated assets, and from 3 co-investors. She had called in February people from her professional network who had known her work for years, and who, seeming wood splitting, when she explained what she was building and why, had said yes, with a speed that told her they had been waiting for something like this, without knowing they were waiting. The fund's mandate was specific, and she had written it herself in a single paragraph that she had revised 18 times before it was right. Investment in businesses led by women who had been structurally excluded from traditional financing channels, not because their enterprises were weak, but because the people controlling the channels had consistently applied filters that had nothing to do with business viability and everything to do with pattern recognition, calibrated by decades of funding people who looked and sounded like the funders. She knew those filters. She had spent years dismantling them in real time, in specific rooms, using precision and competence because those were the tools available to her. She intended to build something that meant the next generation of women didn't have to be as exhaustingly precise, just to be taken seriously. The launch was not a party. She had thought about doing something to mark the occasion and had ultimately decided against anything ceremonial, because ceremony was for audiences, and she didn't need an audience for this. She needed her team and her founding advisors, and a whiteboard and 4 hours to get into the actual work. They spent the morning of the launch day in a working session that covered the first 3 portfolio investment decisions, 2 already in final due diligence, 1 still in early review, and the afternoon, in a strategic planning session about the fund's approach to co-investor development over the next 18 months. At the end of the day, Priya, her chief investment officer, 44, 15 years at institutions that had consistently promoted her ideas under other people's names before she'd finally concluded that she was building for other people's legacies, and raised a coffee cup in the general direction of the room. To things that have our names on them, she said. There were 5 people in the room. They all raised whatever they were holding. To things that have our names on them, Amara said. They drank. Nobody made a speech. Nobody cried, which was right. Not because the moment wasn't significant, but because the significance was in the work. And the work was already happening. And weeping over the beginning of something was an indulgence that could wait until later. They had a third portfolio decision to get through before 6 o'clock. They got through it. In late April, the management of the metal fabrication company in the Bronx contacted Amara through the independent oversight board that had been established as part of the settlement terms. The company employed part 231 people. It had operated through the 4 months of Black Harbor's restructuring uncertainty without a single layoff, which had been possible because the oversight mechanism Amara had required as a non-negotiable settlement term had protected the payroll structure during the period of greatest instability. The workers had not known, during those months, how close they had come to a different outcome. They had simply come to work, done their jobs, and trusted that the machinery above them was functioning. The company's general manager, Ronaldo, 9 years in the role, solid, the kind of leader who communicated in specific facts rather than organizational abstractions, had requested the gathering through the board with a simple explanation. A sound like green wood splitting, the people who work here survived something without knowing they survived it, and they deserve to know who made that possible. Amara sat with the invitation for a day. She was not looking for recognition, not from this, not from the corporate record correction, not from any external source. She had done what she did because it was the correct thing to do, and because it protected people who deserved protection, and those reasons had been sufficient without requiring an audience. But the 231 people in that building were the reason she had been careful. They were specifically why she had spent the extra time, in the middle of her own legal crisis, ensuring that the disclosure process was structured to protect the legitimate operations, rather than simply dismantle everything connected to the CO name. They had been the real stakes, not her marriage, not her financial reputation, not even her legal protection, though all of those mattered. The real stakes had always been the people whose names were not on any document she'd ever signed, who had never been asked whether they consented to having their livelihoods depend on the outcome of decisions made in rooms they would never enter. She replied yes. The gathering was held on a Thursday evening in the fabrication floor, cleared and arranged with folding tables and chairs in the informal configuration of people who work with their hands, and would not be comfortable in something that felt like a ceremony. The equipment had been pushed to the walls. There was food from a catering company from the neighborhood. There was coffee in large urns at the side tables. Amara arrived before the workers came in. She walked through the space alone. For a few minutes, the cleared floor, the pushed-back machinery, the organized materials staging along the walls. She looked at the equipment with the specific attention of someone who understood what it represented, not as capital assets on a balance sheet, but as the daily reality of people who came here 5 days a week and applied specific skills to specific materials to produce specific things, and who needed this place to still exist in order to do that. Still existed. She stood in the middle of the floor and felt something she recognized, after a moment, as a form of satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition, the particular satisfaction of a structural decision correctly made. The weight-bearing calculation that held, the floor that did not give way. The workers began arriving at 6. By 6:30, the space held most of the workforce in the particular atmosphere of a gathering that doesn't have a script, people talking in the easy, slightly formal way of colleagues in an unusual configuration of their usual space, the social temperature somewhere between a work event and a neighborhood gathering. Ronaldo addressed the room at 6:45. He was specific and direct in the way of a man who has been running a physical operation for 9 years and has no patience for corporate language. He talked about what the previous 4 months had actually been, not the organizational language of restructuring and transition, but the real experience of not knowing whether the place would survive, and what that uncertainty had looked like from inside the operation. He talked about the morning the independent oversight announcement came through and what it had meant for the people who had been updating their resumes at night after their families went to sleep. Then he said there was a person who made specific decisions, to make sure this place was protected. She didn't have to include us in how she structured what she was doing. She could have drawn the lines differently, and we would never have known. But she didn't draw them differently. She drew them the way she drew them, and we still have jobs. He looked at Amara. I want Miss Lennox to come up here, he said. And I want everyone in this room to understand who she is and what she chose to do. Amara walked to the front of the room. She had prepared nothing to say. She stood in the middle of a fabrication floor in the Bronx in front of 231 people, and she let the moment be what it was without managing it, which was something she had gotten better at over the previous 5 months, the capacity to be in a situation without simultaneously controlling the presentation of herself within it. The room applauded. It was not polite applause. It was the genuine applause of people expressing real gratitude for a specific thing, and it had a quality, sustained, warm, a sound like ceremonial, not ceremonial that landed in the chest differently than any other version of acknowledgement she had received in 20 years of professional life. She had been congratulated in conference rooms. She had received professional acknowledgement in industry settings. She had been praised by people whose praise was worth something in the specific currency of her field. None of it had felt like this, because none of it had been from people for whom was not an abstract professional achievement, but is not an abstract promotion pretension. The continued existence of a paycheck, a health benefit, a reason to put the resume away. She stood and let it happen. She did not look down. She did not deflect or minimize or perform the particular brand of modest discomfort that women in professional settings are often expected to perform when acknowledged in a room. She stood and received it with the same directness with which she had done the work that warranted it. When the applause settled, she looked at the room. Thank you for still being here, she said. That was always the point. She meant it as the complete statement it was. She spent the next 2 hours in the gathering, moving through the room, learning names, hearing the individual versions of what the uncertain months had been like for people whose daily stakes missed no toll in a way that hers, for all the legal and financial weight she'd been carrying, had not been. She could rebuild. She had rebuilt. These people needed the building to survive in its current form. A woman named Deshauna, who managed one of the material staging teams and had 2 kids in middle school, told her that she had spent 3 months updating her resume every night after her children went to sleep, just keeping it current. Not because she had given up, but because the uncertainty required the preparation, and she had refused to be caught unprepared. I put it away when the announcement came through, Deshauna said. Haven't opened it since. Amara looked at her, at the specific expression of a woman who had maintained her composure through months of uncertainty and had come out the other side still functional, not unaffected, not unchanged, but intact. Keep it put away, Amara said. Working on it, Deshauna said. And then she laughed, the released tension kind, the kind that comes when something has been held for a long time, and there is finally sufficient safety to let it go. Amara drove back to Manhattan at 9. The city lights moved past the car window in the particular sequence of the route she'd taken 100 times, familiar enough to be invisible. She sat in the back and let the evening settle around her rather than immediately reaching for the next thing. She was tired in the specific way of having been genuinely present for several hours, not functionally present, not professionally present, but actually there, in the room, with the people in it. Sound like green without the insulating layer of management that she had worn in professional spaces for so long that she had stopped noticing the weight of it. It had felt different. She intended to feel it again. She ran into Kang-hyun in early June. She had not planned it and could not have predicted it, and the city being the size it was, the coincidence of it seemed both improbable and, in some way she couldn't rationally account for, entirely consistent with the way this story had moved from its beginning. She was leaving a coffee meeting, in Midtown a conversation, with one of the fund's advisory board members about a potential third-round co-investor, and she was thinking about a specific question that had come up in the meeting, her attention half in the conversation she'd just had, and half on what came next, the particular divided focus of someone moving between 2 things simultaneously. She turned a corner. He was 20 feet ahead of her on the same sidewalk, walking in her direction. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. They both stopped. The city did not stop. People moved around them in both directions. Traffic continued. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Of tourists with a map consulted it with the intense focus of people who have given themselves permission to stand still in the middle of a sidewalk. The world was entirely occupied with itself and had no interest in the two people who had stopped on it. He looked different. Not worse, just different, in the way of someone who has been removed from the structure that organized his daily existence and has not yet fully rebuilt the replacement. Thinner, yes, but more than that, less armored. Particular quality of a man who has spent 15 years operating with the kind of ambient authority that comes from being the person everyone in a room is oriented toward, and who is now navigating spaces without that gravity, and hasn't yet settled into the version of himself that exists without it. He was wearing a dark jacket over a shirt with an open collar. She had never seen him without a suit in a professional context in 8 years of being his wife. The only time she had seen him without the full armor of professional presentation were at home, in the specific privacy of their shared domestic space. Seeing him like this on a midtown sidewalk was disorienting in a small way that she noted and filed. She looked, she assumed, like herself. She had worked on this, the continuity of external presentation, while everything interior was being rebuilt, not as deception, but as a form of self-respect. She was not performing stability she didn't have. She was maintaining the appearance of a person who was still fully operational because she was the operational fully operational, even when the operational machinery was running on something different than it had run on before. He walked the 20 feet to where she was standing. It occurred to her that he could have crossed the street, could have made the visual calculation that the sidewalk was wide enough to navigate without direct encounter. The fact that he hadn't, that he had walked directly toward her, told her that he had made a different calculation, and she found herself curious about what it was. Amara, he said, Kang-hyun, 12 inches of city sidewalk between them. 6 months since the conference room. A lifetime since the estate. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who is looking at a person rather than an image of a person actually seeing, not pattern matching. She recognized the difference. She had spent 8 years. She had spent 8 years in a marriage where she had felt herself gradually shift from the first category to the second, and she knew what both looked like from the receiving end. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said, not correcting, not performing, just being precise, which had always been her first language. He nodded. A pause that held more than it needed to, but not more than it could. "I heard about the fund," he said. "Early days yet. The Ingrid Holst contract." He said it simply, without making anything of it. He looked at him. She had not expected him to know that name, and then she had, because he had always paid attention to things that mattered even when he had stopped paying attention to her. "You keep track." "I thought I should understand what I'd been missing," he said. "Looking at what you're building seemed like the accurate way to do that." She considered this. "What did you understand?" she asked. Not as a test, as a genuine question. He was quiet for a moment. The truck at the corner finished its idling and pulled away. The tourists with the map had sorted themselves out and were moving. "That you were always doing 2 things simultaneously," he said. "Everything you did for Black Harbor and everything you were becoming independent of it. I told myself the second thing was career maintenance. Professional habit. I didn't see it as preparation." "It wasn't preparation," she said, not deliberately. "It was just what I needed to keep. I know that now." He looked at the sidewalk briefly and then back at her. "I thought I was letting you keep it. I thought allowing you to maintain your independent professional identity was a form of respect." "Allowing," she said. He heard it, the specific weight of the word. "Yes, that word is the problem, isn't it? It's accurate to how you thought about it." "Yes," he said. "It is." Another pause. "How is your mother?" she asked. Not because she expected warmth in the answer. Their relationship had never arrived at warmth and was not going to find it now. But because Myung-ja was 63 years old and was Kang-hyun's mother and had been a part of Amara's life for 8 years, and the question was honest. She's managing, he said. She doesn't fully understand what happened. She understands that Amara left and that the businesses had problems. The specific architecture of it, he paused. She's not someone who looks closely at architecture. No, Amara said. She never was. She asked about you, he said. Once. In February. She asked if you were all right. Amara looked at him. She asked through me rather than calling you herself, he said. I know. I know too, Amara said. I told her you were more than all right. A pause. That was accurate. She looked at him for a moment, the man she had married at 33, the man she had rescued 3 times, the man who had maintained the option of her destruction and had not used it, and had ultimately, when it mattered, said yes to everything that was required of him, without making her fight for it. The man who was now standing on a midtown sidewalk in a jacket with an open collar, trying to understand, too late and with too much clarity, the specific weight of what he had not seen. I have to go, she said. He nodded. Of course. He didn't move immediately. Amara. He said her name the way he had said it, the first time she'd heard him say it, not as a title, not as a role, just as the name of a specific person he was addressing. I want you to know that I understand, now, what you were. What you actually were inside that organization and inside that marriage. Not what you provided, what you were. She let the sentence land. She let it be what it was honest. Too late, genuinely meant, insufficient to change anything that had happened, and still worth saying. I know, she said. Not it's enough, not I forgive you. Not that helps. Just I know. The acknowledgement of the acknowledgement with no obligation attached. She walked past him. She did not look back. She reached the car at the corner, got in, and sat for 30 seconds before telling the driver to go. Not because she was undone, she was not undone, but because she had learned, in the 9 months since November, to give real encounters the 30 seconds they deserved before moving past them. The encounter had been real. He had been real in it. The thing he'd said had been real. She gave it 30 seconds. Then, 43rd, please. The car moved into traffic. The first of Lennox Meridian's portfolio companies secured a major contract in July. Ingrid, the accessibility equipment manufacturer in Queens. 6 years of consistent demand and no access to the capital she needed to scale had been in final negotiations with a housing authority initiative for 11 weeks when the contract was confirmed on a Thursday afternoon. She called Amara. She was crying, which was information Ingrid was not a crier. She was a builder, and the crying said something about the accumulated weight of 6 years of being told. The operation was too small, too niche, not quite fundable enough, despite the numbers being exactly what the numbers needed to be. 4 years I've been trying to get this kind of contract, Ingrid said. Her voice was breaking around the edges of it, but not collapsing. 4 years of, it's promising, but the scale is, and we like the concept, but the... Yeah. Stopped. You just looked at the numbers. The numbers were correct, Amara said. Everyone said they were correct. Nobody would fund the correct numbers. I know, Amara said. That's not a market failure. That's a filter failure. The market was fine. The filter was wrong. Is that how you see it? That's exactly how I see it, Amara said. You weren't the problem. The problem was who was doing the looking. Ingrid was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Thank you, she said. It was simple, and it was complete. Go celebrate, Amara said, and then come back Monday, and we'll talk about the scaling timeline. Monday, Ingrid said. Absolutely. After the call, Amara went to the window of the Lennox Meridian office and stood looking at the city for several minutes without reaching for the next thing. She let herself simply stand in the fact of it. A business that had been undercapitalized for six years because a woman was running it just secured a contract that would sustain it for 3 years. Because someone had looked at the actual numbers. It was not the end of anything and not the solution to the systematic filter problem and not a transformation of the industry. It was one contract, one company, one woman who had been told not quite enough times and who now had capital and a contract and a scaling timeline for Monday. That was real. Amara stayed at the window for 3 more minutes. Then she went back to her desk. In late August, 9 months after the Sunday at the estate, Sachin's Keenan Amara sat in her apartment on a Thursday evening with the city visible through the large windows and the Lennox Meridian portfolio dashboard open on her laptop, and a cup of tea that had gone slightly cool while she was reading. She was 42 years old. She was divorced. She was the founder and managing director of a fund with 11 portfolio companies, a growing advisory board, and a capital base that was, by the specific technical measures she had spent 20 years applying to other people's enterprises, healthy and correctly positioned for the growth she'd planned. She checked this periodically with honest attention, genuinely engaged in what she was doing. Not performing engagement, not maintaining functional momentum while waiting for the real thing to arrive. Actually present, actually interested, actually motivated by the specific work in front of her in a way that she recognized, with some private honesty that didn't require external acknowledgement. She had not been inside Black Harbor's orbit for at least 3 years before everything had collapsed. Collapse had been necessary. This was not something she had believed in November. In November, she had understood that what was happening was survivable and had focused entirely on surviving it with integrity. The idea that the rupture itself might have been not good, not fortunate, not anything that required the pain to be minimized in order to make the narrative neater but necessary. Specific sense that the structure she had been inside had become something that could not have continued producing her actual self, only a functional version of it. That idea had arrived quietly, over months, as an observation rather than a revelation. She did not tell the story of it as a clean arc. Clean arcs were for people who needed the story to be comfortable. She needed it to be true. The truth was, November, and the gray apartment, and Celeste Kwan's folder, and the contingency note, and the word cleanable, and the 6-hour mediation session, and the ceiling tile, and the fabrication floor in the Bronx, and Deshauna's resume, and the sidewalk sock in June. And Ingrid crying on the phone, and 11 portfolio companies, and Priya raising a coffee cup, and a settlement document in a locked drawer, and a divorce decree filed in the same folder. All of it, unsimplified. She was still inside it, in the way that people remain inside things that have shaped them, not trapped, not looking backward, but carrying it in the specific way that experience becomes part of the body rather than a story the mind tells about the past. Her phone lit up on the desk. A message from Priya: Ingrid's production expansion starts Monday. She wants us there for day 1. You in? Amara looked at the message. She thought like Green. She thought about a fabrication floor in the Bronx where people were still employed because she had drawn the lines the way she drew them. She thought about Ingrid putting the phone down on Thursday afternoon and going to celebrate whatever celebrating looked like for a woman who had been waiting 6 years for this particular contract. She thought about Deshauna's resume closed in a drawer, not opened since November. She typed, "Tell her we'll be there. 7 a.m. She set the phone down. She looked at the city through the large windows, the particular quality of late August in New York, the light going amber at the edges of the buildings, while the streets below moved in the blue-gray of early evening. The specific density of a city, the specific contains millions of rooms where decisions are being made about people who deserve better than those decisions. She thought about what Lenora had said months ago, in the early days of all of it, in the passing way of observations that don't announce their own importance. You spent 8 years being the most valuable person in a room that refused to count you. Now you get to decide which room you walk into. She had been walking into different rooms since April. She intended to keep walking into them. A sound like green wood splitting. Not because the rooms she'd left had been wrong about everything. Some of what she'd built inside Black Harbor's legitimate structure had been genuinely good work. And some of the people she'd worked alongside had been genuinely worth the effort. And even the marriage, at its beginning, had been real in a way she was not going to retroactively deny, because its ending had been devastating. She had loved him. That had been true. The love and the loss of it, and the specific way it had ended, were all true simultaneously, which was what actual experience was, not a single clean line, but a complex of things that coexisted without resolving into simplicity. She had gotten better over 9 months at holding complexity without needing it to resolve. This was, she thought, probably the most durable thing she had built in the year that had just passed. Not the fund, though the fund was real. Not the settlement, though the settlement was necessary. Not the corporate record correction, though the correction mattered. The most durable thing was this: the capacity to stand inside her own life and find it sufficient without requiring it to be what it was not. The specific and quiet and unspectacular version of being all right that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Because it is simply the baseline condition of a person who has done the work of becoming, by degrees, herself again. Picked up her tea. It was cool. She drank it anyway. Outside the large windows, the city held at its enormous ordinary pace, the density of millions of people navigating their specific and imperfect lives, making decisions in rooms that mostly went unrecorded, building things that mostly went unacknowledged, surviving things that mostly went unseen. She had survived. She had built. And every document that came from that building had her name on it, exactly where it belonged, exactly as she had always warranted, with no one else's signature required to make it real. She closed the portfolio dashboard. She opened the file for Monday. She got back to work.